I should say I'm not really an economist. I'm,
No,
I'm a journalist covering economics. I don't want to be described as an economist. Heaven forfend.
Conway, thank you very much for joining us on SCOTONOMICS. A wonderful opportunity to chat about your new book, Material World, and a few other things as well.
Sure.
There's some really fascinating stories in here, but I kind of wanted to concentrate on the impact that this journey's had on you. We're going to touch on climate change, but also social and environmental justice, power or material footprint, the colonial nature of resource extraction, and the impact of globalization. Does that sound good?
That sounds good, yeah.
But before we get into that, I'd like to know a little bit more detail about the book. So in your story of the Material World, there are 6 main characters. Can you tell us why there's only 6 and why you chose them briefly?
There's only 6 because it's 500 pages, and any more I think would have been too much. I did originally I was going to do 7, and there's no science about why it's a certain number. It's just like each of these different materials, so it's sand, salt, copper, iron, oil, and lithium. Each of these different things gives you a little window into the way this kind of underbelly of the world economy works. And in order to kind of come up with them, there was no, I'm a data nerd, as you know, but there was no spreadsheet which said what are the most important materials in the world, and how kind of embedded in the economy are there. It just doesn't exist. Partly, actually, there's a whole conversation we can have about whether there needs to be much more data on stuff. Ask them, from geologists to scientists to economists to people who work on supply chains, the whole lot, trying to ask, okay, well, if you were trying to come up with a list of the things that we need the most just to make everything else work, then what would you come up with? And some of them were obviously always going to be in there. So sand is kind of amazing, both because it's everywhere. Silica is the biggest kind of solid element in the world in terms of the constituents of the Earth's crust. Sand, we all walk on it on the beach all the time, and yet we use sand both to make the buildings that we inhabit. So it's a part of cement and a part of concrete. We use it to make new land. So the vastness of how much sand we get out of the ground is kind of staggering. If you look at a pie chart of the stuff that we extract from the earth and turn into products, which is kind of what Material World is about, sand is way at the top, way above anything else, way above any fossil fuels, way above any metal. It's sand, and that's basically a story of concrete and to some extent China. So you've got that vastness, but by the same token, you can take sand and turn it into glass, and glass is the first great technology perhaps that humankind has ever made, this bionic technology, and able to see further. And
you said it kind of bookends history, didn't it? At the moment, kind of the earliest manufactured product and the most cutting edge at the moment, and I found that a really interesting window. What one missed out then?
It was wood. So I was going to have wood. That wood was going to be my 7th material, and actually I went to the length. So I did a lot of research. So I read a lot of books, and also went on a few trips. I went to meet with some forestry people. I went to see some trees being ripped down. It's actually pretty intense the way that is it deforestation? The way that trees are chopped down. Those kind of rigs that you have attached.
Well, it's like the factories you were in. There's no humans, is it? It's just machines just cutting everything, cutting everything down.
It's and the extent to which, and there's what I found coming at this as someone not an economist, but with an economist's brain, I guess, was you see so many manifestations of what typically economists might call productivity. So we're making a lot of this stuff, but the fascination with this little bit of the economy, because all of the stuff I talk about in this book constitutes a tiny part of gross domestic product. It's getting stuff out of the ground, it's turning it into products. Manufacturing is ever smaller as a constituent part of GDP. Mining is ever smaller as a constituent part of GDP. By far and away, the vast majority of what we consider to be the economy is services. But getting this stuff out of the ground, we've become so efficient in it. And in a sense, it's a success story that this stuff is such a small part of GDP. Because 100, 200 years ago, getting stuff out of the ground, whether it was food or minerals, and turning it into the stuff that we used all the time, was pretty much everything. Agriculture, we were all working in the fields because it was a really inefficient way of trying to grow food. We didn't have modern steel the ploughs, we didn't have the fertilizers that allow you to kind of have this incredibly large yield for crops. So our efficiency in actually creating this stuff with ever fewer human inputs, because we're not working in the fields, is in some senses an enormous success story. The fact that you don't have, there's not a member of everyone's family that works in mining, which is kind of the way it was in large parts of the country not that long ago, is a success story, because fewer people are dying in mining, because it's a very dangerous thing to be doing, and it's also, it's not good for your health. But by the same token, we've become disconnected with this. It's not like we're not growing food anymore, it's just that we're doing it at an industrial scale with fewer people involved. It's not like we're not doing mining anymore. So, well, we're not doing it in this country, but it's happening somewhere else. And by putting this stuff kind of out of sight, it's kind of left our consciousness. And I think that is part, of the explanation for why people feel a bit disconnected these days. I think we have lost our connection with parts of the world, and I think there are almost some mental health consequences to that, not having a sense of purpose. But I think also, because it's out of sight, you don't have to think about the emissions, you don't have to think about the compromises, you don't have to think about all of the problems embedded in this stuff. You just go out, you buy your phone and don't think any more about it. And but always that there's nuance here, and we do have a kind of success story of to some extent. I mean, it's really hard to adjust for the fact that we have deindustrialized a lot in this country. How much of that is responsible for the fact that we have had a massive fall in our emissions? Quite a lot. And it's quite hard to adjust for that. How much of it have we offshored? But by the same token, we have done some things well. There has been a genuine per capita kind of reduction in our emissions. It's just been much less than those overall figures, the headline figures would have you believe. And it's only when you kind of delve into that and look at the nuance that you see, this is a more interesting and uncomfortable story. Like the whole point of this and the whole point of the book is, if you're not discomforted reading it, then there's a problem, because the compromises endemic in just everyday life are there, and I just don't think we should be ignoring them. I think we should be facing up to them, because right now a lot of us, a lot of politicians, a lot of everyone has big ideas for what kind of a world we want to inhabit in 2050. It's all about net zero, it's all about this stuff. It's great to have these visions, but if we don't understand what the present day actually involves, how stuff is made, how it gets to you, what kind of emissions happen along the way, what kind of damage is done to local people along the way, if we don't understand that stuff that's happening right now, then how on earth are we going to actually do it for the future? How can we understand the future if we don't understand the present? So the point of this is to say, let's just think for a bit about, hang on, how are we all fed? We're all fed because we consume a lot of food that is made thanks to fertilizer. About 9/10 of the food in this country is made thanks to fertilizer. Where does that fertilizer come from? Natural gas. That is where fertilizer comes from. It is made from natural gas. It's a fossil fuel product. In other words, if it wasn't for that, then we wouldn't be here. And I think once you start to understand that, then you realise, well, this is not straightforward. It's not as simple as just turning off a few coal-fired power stations and replacing them with wind turbines. It's about reimagining the way that the entire set of the infrastructure that we rely on is actually put together.
Yeah, and I think as you go through the book and you discuss the technologies, again, from an ecological economics perspective, you're just seeing that the pollution doesn't disappear. It just changes into some different form of pollution. And the classic example is all the horse shit that was removed from the cities was a wonderful thing for 50 years, and then we realised that actually the carbon was causing more of a problem. And this is this idea of kind of almost like Techno Utopia, that will always have a technology that kind of solves all of these problems. And one question I had for me was going into some of these industries and seeing this kind of amazing insight to the human brain and the intellectual capacity of humans to see these things being made. Were you leaving thinking, do you know what? We humans, we've got kind of climate change. We can solve it if we can, make a transistor that's got 2 billion.
Yeah.
2 billion transistors.
I probably slightly err on the techno-optimist side of things in that I do have faith in our ability to confront problems and resolve them. But where I'm a bit more concerned is that, every time we've done it in the past, and we have done it quite a few times in the past, we've created our own problems along the way. So, for instance, the initial example of that is like, so the horse manure kind of filling the streets of London, and people getting kind of worried about that, and then the motor car comes along and solves it and creates its own problems. That's like one. There's so many of those examples when you kind of dig through history, and there's kind of quite a few of them in the book. Like, when coal came along, a lot of people saw coal as the great savior of the environment. And why was that? It was because right at that point in the kind of 16th, 17th century, the thing that people were fretting about was that all the forests were going to be chopped down, because you needed charcoal for furnaces to make steel and to make glass, and you needed the kind of the potash that you got from the trees to make the fertilizer and the different chemicals that you're using in all of your processes. So trees were being chopped down, and that's before you get into the fact that you need it for masts and things. Trees were being chopped down at such a rate that there was panic, and there were various rules that were imposed, even at the time actually of Elizabeth I, of you can only chop down so many trees.
I think that continually looking at technology through this extension of material consumption never solves any problem. It just pushes it on to another thing. And you touch in the book what happens in the the lithium mines and the huge social and the issues of environmental justice and all of these areas where there's mining. So it is just taking one problem and moving it somewhere else. And my perspective is that we tend to take the problems that we have in the global north and we remove them, and then we just drop them on to the global south, and that seems to be a thread, I think, that goes through your book as well. Can we just touch on that then? So when you were researching this, tell me about the British Empire.
There's a really good example of it, which is in India, where so actually it wasn't just India, but a lot of our colonies, we were using them essentially as markets for all of our goods, and one of the goods that we were trying to sell a lot of was salt. So we in the UK, we have a lot of salt deposits in Cheshire. We have a lot of salt in parts of England, Cheshire mostly. There's other parts as well, but Cheshire is basically sitting on top of this enormous kind of bed of salt. And during the period of empire, we kind of used a lot of our colonies to become markets for various things like salt. And what that meant in practice was us going into like India, basically saying, you can't make your own salt. And salt is this incredibly important thing. We are all dead if we don't have salt all the time. Your ability to make salt is to some extent it's been used by just despots in the past as an ability to control the population. In China, they have for years had this salt monopoly. The government has had a monopoly on the production of salt. It only came to an end actually a few years ago, and it's often been said, and there are various studies that historical studies which have shown the most despotic regimes happen to be the ones which have lots of taxes and lots of monopolies on salt. And salt, for a long time, why salt? Well, because it's important for one's physical survival, but also because salt is the basis, the bedrock for making anything in the economy, for chemicals, for health, for making any pharmaceuticals, for all of this stuff. Anyway, and it's for a long time been very expensive to make. To make salt, you need to evaporate it, and you need to evaporate a lot of water from seawater, a lot of water from seawater. It's quite energy intensive, the process. And so for a long time, Britain wanted, in the same way that it did with many of its other goods, to dominate global salt production. And when it went into India, it saw, as well as seeing all of the other kind of colonial kind of benefits that you might get from dominating the Indian population, it saw a massive market. And essentially what happened was Britain essentially kind of stopped India from making its own salt. So making your own salt became illegal within India. You can only do it under license of Britain, and the objective there was to try to encourage India to import all of their salt from Cheshire. And so for a period, the UK became the world's biggest salt producer, and salt, like I say, was the thing that made the rest of the world go round. Became the biggest salt producer, selling our salt to places like India, and not letting them make their own salt. And it was such a kind of fiercely fought campaign that there had to be kind of policemen who were there preventing people from making their own salt throughout India. There was the Great Hedge of India, this kind of, you kind of heard about the Great Wall of China, but there was...
Yeah, I thought you'd made that up when I read it in the book. It was a couple of 1,000 kilometres long, wasn't it?
Yeah, there was a real thing. There was a hedge that was grown in order to stop people smuggling salt around India, parts of India. And I guess the kind of the apotheosis of this was when Gandhi did his march for freedom in India, and what he chose as a symbol to show that no, we are an independent nation, we're able to do our own stuff, was to go to the beach, to march to the beach, and then make salt. And he chose salt as a symbol because that was one of the things that the British Empire was trying to suppress. A country's ability, a people's ability to make this critical substance. The fact that it was salt that was critical to that, I think, underlines that this was a material that Britain was using as a form of control and suppression. And the fact that it was salt is not coincidental, because throughout history, countries from China to all around the world have used salt as a means to control the population. I mean, if you look back at the French Revolution, one of the taxes that people most hated and led to the revolt was the gabelle. It was a French tax on salt. And in a way, the taxes on salt were some of the earliest forms of like poll tax, because everyone had to pay them. We've all got to keep alive. We've all got to consume salt. We've got to use it in various forms to, for our health. And yet, at each stage, countries have tried, leaders have tried to use it as a means of controlling the population. It's remarkable how much that's happened.
It was quite a good example, that one, of it's not resource extraction, it was stopping the country accessing its own resources. So it's still a similar thing. But one of the things I was looking at again through the book was this idea of what makes a country resilient. And this is certainly when we're talking about industrial strategy now, and you were looking at periods in the past when countries were looking at their need to access sand to make glass, salt for all the reasons that you've said. But I think we've entered a period now, kind of post-globalization, and your little journey through this, how realistic is it when you hear a politician saying things like, we've got to buy British, or we have to make it in America? Because some of your examples of the global supply chain for something would just blow people's minds. Is it feasible that a country now can pretty much stand separate from anyone else and live any kind of similar life that they are just now?
No, it's totally infeasible. The example I focus on a lot in the book is silicon chips. And there is no way you could kind of centralize the production of a silicon chip in a single country. No way. There's just too many inputs, too many different specialisms, too many different parts, too many different expertises. And I think you don't have to just be a kind of laissez-faire libertarian to believe that having a kind of global market where certain people are very good at making certain things is part of the answer for how we have the standard of living that we have today. The issue, of course, is that some of the time the things that are made aren't being properly priced. And when you're buying a solar panel from China, it's very cheap, but the thing that's not kind of taken into consideration is what are the trade-offs that are actually there in the production of that solar panel. And those trade-offs, include the fact that coal is often used kind of heavily as the power source to make those panels. Also, actually chemically to make the actual silicon itself. So the fact that the labour standards are far inferior, generally speaking, in China than they are elsewhere around the world, especially in Xinjiang province. It's also the fact that the effluent from the mining processes to make that solar panel is often just punted off into the river.
Well, this is a social cost, isn't it? And everyone's aware of the social cost of carbon. I was thinking, how much would a gram of salt actually cost if you had to look at the social cost, and the same the lithium in your battery and all of these things. So what you're saying is there's a huge social cost, and the way that we look at the economy just externalizes that, doesn't involve that, it doesn't engage with that process at all with the pricing.
I think that's right. It doesn't. It fixates on one thing, which is generally speaking the finished price, and not on the compromises along the way. It doesn't focus on things like, well, carbon. We're trying to come up with kind of ways of embedding that into the price, but that's only one thing. But what about water? What about labour standards? What about other forms of pollution? I mean, those things are massive, and I think that's the issue, is that until you looking at the world from the kind of bottom up, which is the point of the book, then allows you to see with slightly more detail what those compromises actually are. And for me, that's quite kind of revolutionary, because I used to not to think about this stuff, and now I do, and it kind of changes your perspective on the products you're using.
Yeah. No, absolutely. That's certainly the figures never balance in terms of materials exported to materials imported. Everyone always imports more than the country says of exports. Is that just down to a black market, or is there any other reason why those figures just don't really see? I think two or three times. Yeah. 2 or 3 times. I think the difference was.
I think it's a black market. I think like it's understandable that the voguish thing right now is carbon, and I think clearly understandably so, because there is a climate challenge, a very specific climate challenge with carbon. But we are kind of devouring minerals at this extraordinary rate that, and I think that in order to get to net zero carbon, we need to do even more mining than we've ever done before. And so I'm surprised, I guess, that while we fixate on carbon, we're kind of not thinking about some of the other compromises along the way in order to get there. So we need to do a lot more mining. We need a lot more water. We need a lot of kind of energy along the way. All of these things are kind of quite knotty and interrelated issues, and I'm kind of surprised that we don't talk more about them. I guess partly because I'm surprised, because actually once you do start to think about things from the kind of perspective of here's what it takes to make something, then actually everything else becomes kind of a lot clearer. You start to see that, if you're making a silicon chip, you have to get the silicon, you have to mine stuff out of the ground. You have to put it into a furnace and turn rock into metallurgical silicon, which involves burning it alongside coal. These processes to make, and that's the same when it comes to making silicon solar panels as well as silicon chips. It's basically the same chemical process. These processes are like really energy intensive. They're quite carbon intensive. But I think also kind of strikingly, they're quite old. It's not like we've come up with a new way of making metallurgical silicon in the last 100 years. We're doing it now in the same way that we have been for 100 years. Similar thing with steel. We're making steel, for the most part, the same way that we have for hundreds of years. And having to come up with new replacements for those processes, which is about getting materials, is going to be really, really hard. And we're nowhere near actually kind of achieving it. And I think if all you're focusing on is the main, headline number of carbon emissions, then that's going to lead you down the road of deindustrializing, not thinking pragmatically about where stuff comes from, and along the way, your other footprints can go up. And I think it's not a kind of joined up, grown up approach to making the planet a better place.
It's kind of a bite-sized thing, isn't it? That's the thing about carbon. It's like I kind of understand that, and it's bite-sized. But from an ecological perspective, climate change is one of the 9 planetary boundaries, which could put us into a position where the Earth tips into a state that it becomes not habitable. So it's just a tiny part of it, but we only really seem to concentrate on that. And I think the interesting thing within your book was you were starting to point to positions where you were saying these are the other things that are involved in making the things that are in your car, in your food, in your pocket. And I think one of your examples was one of the factories used more energy than the city of Liverpool.
Yeah.
I think, so all of these things that we use are hugely energy intensive. And if you look at world GDP, it tracks almost to one, almost identical with energy use. So GDP and energy use, and at some point we're going to have to change that relationship. So how ready are we when all of the things that we rely on are so energy intensive?
I think some of the time the deployment of more energy leads to better living standards. And so some of the time, it's a straightforwardly good thing. Some of the time it doesn't necessarily, it's just, consumption for consumption's sake. And trying to kind of draw a line between those two things is difficult, maybe impossible. But I do kind of think that, to be honest with you, I'm in two minds about it. I think that there's something that's kind of amazing about human ingenuity that's got us to where we are. Part of this book is to look at ordinary objects, like a glass or like a semiconductor, and to say there's a marvelous story behind them. It's kind of amazing.
It's a story of wonder, isn't it? That's what comes in the book. Absolutely, yeah.
But by the same token, because we don't think about that story of wonder much, up until I did the book, I didn't spend much time thinking about where my phone came from. I think we're quite complacent about it, and we're quite decadent about it. And I think if you spend a bit more time thinking where the products around you actually came from, then you treat them with more respect, and you treat the world around you with more respect. And I certainly, before doing the book, I didn't have a clue about where things happen. That everything is mined. Everything you touch, basically on a daily basis, comes from the ground. If it's not grown, it's mined. And often the stuff that is grown with stuff that's mined, fertilizers. And I didn't spend much time thinking about this at all. I was, I'm a consumer like everyone else, and I bought loads of stuff, and I like my gadgets, and I bought a lot of gadgets. But having started to look beneath the surface and realize what it takes to make those gadgets, I don't buy them as much anymore. I'm not as much of a kind of, disposable consumer as I was before. And I feel like this is part of the root. I kind of tend from the side that you want people to make their own decisions rather than being told what to do. And having understood, hang on, this is the reality of how things are made, I'm much more reluctant to just go out and buy new things. And that's because I feel like I'm more connected now than I was before with the physical world around me. Just because of this intellectual exercise. I think back in the day, our ancestors were more connected with the world around them because they made the stuff. They made the stuff that surrounded them, or they knew the person that made the stuff that surrounded them, knew how much work it involved. And when something was made, it was made to last as long as possible. We've lost a lot of that, and there's long kind of reasons as to why that's happened, and I think there's an interesting conversation about the obsession with growth that probably goes alongside that in GDP. But what I hope, I think some people, when they read the book, will hopefully come to that position of thinking, all this stuff that I buy every day, it's kind of more amazing than I thought it was, and it's also should be respected a bit more perhaps than I respected it before.
Yeah, I mean, I would really hope that people read the book and they say, I didn't know that there was such a downside to all of these things that we use, and I've got to be much more conscious. And my final question for you was a kind of fundamental principle of ecological economics is that wealth is never created, it's transformed. And this is something that mainstream economics just doesn't engage with at all, with these ideas of wealth creators. But we would say that looking at all of the products that you saw, the phone, the car, all of the value from that comes from the minerals and the resources that were transformed. They were transformed from a little bit of grain of sand into a transistor.
Yeah.
And that's where this idea of wealth comes from, this kind of transformation. We've completely lost that as an economics discipline, that kind of understanding. Did you pick up any kind of thread like that when you were, researching the book, where true value really comes from?
It's a really good question. I mean, I think it's. I used to kind of wonder: is there just something kind of endemic or innate within salt or copper or whatever it might be that makes it valuable or special? And there are each of these different materials and elements is good at doing a certain thing. But in the end, I suppose two things. First of all, the transformation is all important. Being able to take a lump of rock and turn it into a semiconductor is extraordinary. It's crazy, and it's unreal what happens in that process of transformation.
And that comes across in the book. You've done that really well.
That is to me, that's the wonder of what humankind is doing. What humankind is doing. We as a species, what do? We take stuff out of the ground or from the trees or whatever, and we turn it into tools that we use to enhance our standard of living. That's what we've been doing since the beginning of our species. That's one of the things that distinguishes us from basically every other species. Some species do use tools to some extent, but they're not shaping and changing the tools to the extent that we do. So that is what makes us human. And what we're doing with taking rock and turning it into semiconductors is exactly the same thing. We're taking simple things and turning them into complex instruments that we then use to improve our standard of living. And I find that utterly amazing. I think 99 point something or other % of that is in the passed down knowledge and expertise from generation to generation in how we make stuff.
But that's where the value is created.
That's the value. And again, a lot of people look at GDP and think it's a kind of pie chart, and you've got services and you've got all different bits and pieces. I kind of think of it as being like this kind of inverted pyramid. So all the stuff that constitutes the majority of value in GDP is services.
But that's because that's where you only charge what you only include at the value of a product once. Yeah. And that's at the finished product.
Right.
So within GDP, you're not allocating it properly because you're not allocating the sales of the material. You're allocating the sales of the phone.
Okay. Yeah.
And it's the same with the services. So you're only allocating the value of the services. But what makes up those services? And it's the idea that you're sitting at a computer and you now live in the service world. And this is what I think the book does so wonderfully well. It says if you're sitting in your computer and you think that we've now got no connection to mining or minerals, everything, it's mad because that's where it all comes from.
Yeah, you're touching it.
And I think for me, it really did show that the world has not moved on to the extent that people think. And that we are still fundamentally in need of the resources that are given to us by the earth.
Yeah.
And we're still fundamentally abusing that relationship. And because all of even the two of the things you spoke about, sand and salt, are so plentiful, right? But they're not sustainable in that classic definition because it takes millions of years to make more of it.
I don't think we're ever going to run out of stuff, but I do think our ability or willingness to go and get stuff and make stuff, that's what I do wonder about. These days, we're not going to get to net zero if we don't have people who are pretty good at getting copper out of the ground. But the number of people who actually want to go into mining in this country is next to nothing. And so there's this paradox that everyone wants to make the world a better place, but are they necessarily kind of applying their expertise in the right direction to make that happen? I think that's a good question. Are people understandably are concerned about wind turbines and pylons in their area, but that is also part of the story of how you kind of decarbonise. I don't have any particular kind of answer to any of these things, but if it's uncomfortable now, it's only going to get more uncomfortable, and there's going to be kind of more knottiness and more conflict in this in the future, I think.
Yeah. And to finish, I did say that I know this book will have turned you into a degrowther, and you said I don't think that's likely to have happened. But I think certainly for me, when I was looking at this book, you're seeing the huge importance of these materials, but you're also seeing the damage that it causes, and I'm sure we would both agree the balance isn't there.
Yeah, I think
for the good and bad, and where we are right now.
I think that we are fixated with growth, and I think that it's not always a healthy thing at all. And I think that it wasn't always that way. We didn't, as within economics, people didn't always fixate on GDP. I mean, it's actually a relatively novel statistic going back to the war. It shouldn't necessarily be your guiding star for how you run an economy. I can understand why it is, because it's slightly straightforward, and it's not. It can sometimes be aligned to living standards, but it's not always. And as we were saying earlier, even within GDP, people always focus on GDP and not GDP per capita. But I think that for me the issue is the dichotomy between the rich world and the rest. I think we could do whatever, I don't know quite what degrowth could consist of, but we could do something like degrowth in a country like this, because we've kind of already got a lot of stuff. We've got the example in the book about this is steel per capita. So the amount of steel that you have embedded in your life as a proportion of the population. Here in the UK and in most parts of Western Europe, we have about, on average, 15 tons of steel per capita, and that's like steel in your car, in your public transport system, in the hospitals and the schools and the buildings that you're in. You could have a kind of argument to say maybe that 15 tons is too high. But what's definitely really striking is the gap between the rich world and the rest is massive. In sub-Saharan Africa, they don't have 15 tons per capita, they've got 0.1 tons per capita. And how do you get sub-Saharan Africa up to a level that maybe isn't as high as the West, because maybe we're a bit high, but certainly a lot higher than they are right now? They want more steel because they want hospitals, they want railways, they want they want cars. And so, but the challenge is, if you're going to get them up to where we are, or even just halfway, even going halfway, you still have to produce more steel than we ever have in the history of humanity. And there is no way of doing that mass producing steel right now without massive carbon emissions. So I kind of think, yes, we could definitely slow down. We've got lots of stuff. We've got the stuff, we've got the steel. But the issue now is how to accommodate a growing population in other parts of the world that don't have the things that we have, and for whom they want better living standards. They want more power. They want more hospitals. They want more cars. They want stuff. And that's not a story of decadence. That's a story of wanting just to have a better life. And having that extra stuff often involves loads of carbon emissions. And this is not a point about degrowth so much as it is a point about the various different kind of plans that we've got to try and get to net zero. I don't know that they've fully accommodated that challenge. In fact, I know that they haven't. That's a conversation that's yet to be had. And I find that scares me a bit, because if it's going to be done in a just way, and let's say we're going to kind of give lots of countries cheap green steel, because you can make it in a green way, but it's just like really expensive, then we have to subsidize it to the tune of trillions and trillions of dollars. And is anyone in this country willing to do that? No way. And so, like I said, if you think it's kind of uncomfortable and knotty, and there's debate and argument about this now, just wait, because it's going to be enormous in the future. But it's also going to be interesting and exhilarating, and intellectually it'll be a journey as well.
A huge challenge. It's a big book. It's worth the challenge getting through this, because it really is fantastic. Ed, thank you so much for joining us and talking about the book.
Thank you.